Oh, hell, Internet! I am a semi-regular viewer of the Rest is Politics podcast, both the UK and US versions, and it's a source of some astonishment and no little chagrin to me that the presenter I identify with most is Alistair Campbell. It is an odd feeling and demonstrative of the nature of so-called balanced political discourse in the Anglosphere. I have roughly judged these presenters in a prior video, but to mention a little more in the current context. Of the four, Campbell is centre-left and is prepared to stand on principles. He seems to be the most reflective, and to make a sweeping statement, I feel like he now has a more sober view of Blairite neoliberalism. Scaramucci seems to be a good guy, but he's a free market zealot and so is just willfully blind to even the possibility of there being structural risks in capitalism. Catty Kay is centre-left, but leads with a very anodyne mainstream media tone, which makes everything out to be just a matter of opinion, really. I have more trouble believing that she would stand on principle than I do with Campbell. If I was a tanky, I would probably be saying, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds, and then nodding sagely as I stroke my beard. But I'm not a tanky. Wait. Ah! And then there's Rory. Rory. Let me preface any critique by saying yes, I do know that Rory is broadly to the left of the mooch and probably by a good distance. And of course, it's more complicated than that anyway. However, when I first watched The Rest is Politics, I was happy to recognise a real compassionate conservative. Thank God, I thought, all is not lost. I can see how good faith debate with the right is possible. And why am I brought to thinking this? Well, that's a bigger question, isn't it? Spoiler alert, it's because straw-manning the left is seen as absolutely fine and a legitimate political tactic, and actively smearing the left is only seen as mildly dishonourable. But it often seems that Rory himself will acknowledge the structural problems which the left point out, the growing inability of politics to claim a functioning mandate in developed societies, and then he immediately will go on to advocate for essentially no structural change whatsoever, because that would be radical, and radical always means either evil or naive. And with that simple declaration, we absolve ourselves of any need to meaningfully discuss radical ideas. That might sound like it's going a bit far, but I will explain why I think it's not. Now, of course, we all know that the left-right political spectrum is not a scientific model, and like everybody else, I will use it for illustrative purposes. And there will be missing nuance, of course. But by any reasonable metric, historically, politics has come from the far right. Monarchism, empire, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This is the ancestor of all status quo thought. But a contingent historical fact does not morally justify itself, and the truths of political life may change through time. But the result of this historical baggage is that all conservative ideologies look like this. Everything right of centre is in the acceptable range of politics because it has at least happened before, and anything left of centre is to be accepted only on sufferance and only piecemeal, lest the avalanche of radical ideas cause the downfall of society. The result of all this is an Overton window that is pulled way to the right before the discussion even starts. This is never acknowledged by any of the mainstream outlets. This is why the left is generally a byword for people who we have to cater to but don't really take seriously. Because of course, they are all blue sky dreamers who don't understand the real world. Which world are we talking about exactly? This fucking world? There are many reasonable voices on the left who clearly get filtered out in this process. Just to take one example, Phil Morehouse, who, judging by his videos, is a Labour guy and significantly to the left of Alistair Campbell. But I defy anyone to say he is not a pragmatic political commentator. So the upshot is no, Keir Starmer is not the friggin' Night's Watch guarding the leftward border against things man was not meant to know. Before I move on, let's consider another response. Somebody could come back and say that, well, the rate of societal change will always be too slow for some, and therefore anything that is considered by the majority to be radical is likely outside the range that would be beneficial to society. Certainly that is true. But on the flip side, it is equally true that if an established system were becoming destructively outmoded over time, then it would only be a radical solution that could create the change necessary to maintain that system before a complete collapse occurs. This is not to justify all radical ideas, of course, but only to suggest that radical ideas are worthy of honest, open discussion, especially in radicalized times. For me, then, Rory Stewart is essentially emblematic of all four Rest is Politics hosts in representing the idea that, essentially, the previous state of quo is fixable, maybe only in need of a few tweaks here and there. That is a judgmental statement, to be sure, and to be absolutely fair, supporting the status quo is generally what a conservative does. But there is a reason why this status quo has brought us to this political moment, and it refers to the Overton window problem I mentioned above, provided that you do agree with my assertion that political discourse is dominated by our far-right history. And yes, this actually includes the excesses of so-called wokeness, but I'm not going to restate my case on that here. Okay, so prepare yourselves. I'm going to get a little bit abstract here to get to a principle. I think all of the four presenters I have named are decent, humane people who live their lives according to a strong moral code that prohibits cruelty based on some metaphysical substratum that endorses restraint. And I put it that way because it begs a question which I want to focus on. What percentage of the world's population fits exactly that description? Seriously, give me a number in the comments before we move on. What percentage of humans in the world are essentially good people who, while they may be imperfect, do not go out of their way to be cruel, dishonest, or manipulative for personal gain? For my part, the answer is certainly over 75% and hopefully over 90%. And these people will largely comply with the law simply because it's the law. But let me go on to say that, whatever your answer is, a conservative mindset compels you to behave as if that number is lower than you personally believe. Call it a margin of safety, if you will. And the more cautious you are, the more you will reduce that number. To speak plainly, the more conservative you are, the more you will accept a political need for treating good people, including good people from cultural bubbles outside your own, as, in fact, bad people, in order to protect your cultural bubble from what you see as being the bad people. And guess what? That would probably be fine, if human politics was historically coming out of essentially centrist roots. But it isn't. And give me your reasoned responses, please, but I feel like all conservatives bluntly refuse to reckon with this, and I don't know why. One possible reason, I suppose, is that the conservative privately believes that there should be a day in the future when no other cultural bubbles than their own actually exist anymore. Hashtag not all conservatives? Question mark. So to conclude this inductive argument, I think that, behaviourally, the compassionate conservative has a wider delta than they would like to believe between their de jure concept of good people and their de facto concept of good people. This is the so-called empathy gap, and it is not the same as a lack of introspection, although that certainly wouldn't help. At the extreme end, the left caricatures this sometimes, and I admit it is a caricature, but I do also see why it's sometimes hard to interpret conservative policies in any other way. The conservative mindset expressed by the empathy gap is essentially, if I haven't experienced it, and this by extension includes all new cultural waves that have started within the last 10 years, then it is absolutely fine for me to consider it to be just not real. Those people who think they stand for such ideas may believe that they are being good people, but I, with my superior rationality and command of the facts of life, am able to determine that they are actually misled, and so sadly do not understand the destructive outcomes of their well-meant but dangerous ideas. But when I do experience one of these things, like having a gay child or directly benefiting from a government agency, well then, that one case can be accepted, and will immediately begin acting as if this was always a centrist position and was never advocated for by the left. Once again, a smug attachment to the belief in one's perfect rationality is not exclusively a conservative trait. Politics is just full of people who think that it is merely about putting their perfect system into place. Very often, these people like to pontificate along the lines of, I am not an optimist or a pessimist, I am a realist. Any assertion of this nature is a flimsy cover for political arrogance. I know what the truth is, bow to my superior rationality. So does that mean I'm against rationality now? No. There are many, many good examples of rationality, but that fact alone does not justify the leap to rational is always good and always leads to truth. This is something explored by, no surprises here, Hannah Arendt, and she recognized that this fallacious leap was part of the Platonic worldview which underpins Western thought. And I take this further and say that this is what has led to the Western's cultural bias and its monotheistic exceptionalism. Western philosophy takes it as an article of faith that the world is fundamentally knowable and that there is one and only one correct way to fundamentally know it. In truth, we have never categorically confirmed this, and it is still perfectly possible that the world is not fundamentally knowable. Coherent models of the world are fundamentally knowable and can be applied to the world in varying degrees through time. But it is equally clear that if you start with different assumptions about the world, then it's totally possible to come up with two different models of the world which are both coherent and yet conflict with each other. But if you cannot help but believe that yours, and only yours, is based on rational principles, then it will be trivially easy for you to discard all others under the rubric that, well, if these people were as rational as I am, then they would think as I do, so I am justified in forcing them to think as I do. Arendt realized that the right uses traditional values and the left uses modern science, especially social science since it is more malleable, in order to justify their claims to represent the most rational and therefore most correct worldview. And she characterized this as the Platonic dominance of the vita contemplativa, the life of ideas, over the vita activa, the life of action. But you can check out my videos on Arendt for more details. An unnecessary amount of detail, perhaps. Now I have employed some strident rhetoric here myself. It seems to be necessary in political discourse these days, and you might be inclined to accuse me of the same arrogance of rationality. But let me point out that I have not said that anyone is wrong about their politics. If I were to break it down into an internet-friendly numbered list, then I suppose I have asserted that 1. Insofar as the left-right spectrum is meaningful, the Overton window is pulled massively to the right by humanity's historical dependence on far-right politics. 2. Whatever your appraisal of the moral status of the median human, the more conservative you are, the more you will revise that number down in practice as a margin of safety. 3. The current centre-right form of democracy, known as neoliberalism, is failing to avoid the immiseration of the working people who would be benefited by policies that are further to the left. And 4. Recognizing the nature of the Overton window would allow a broader range of discussion and acknowledgement of good faith. For a start, if politics were truly anchored to the centre, then fewer left-wing ideas would be radical by default. I personally will stand on some radical ideas, but is it fair to call me a political radical? If you look at the history of videos on my channel, then you will see that, up to the last year at least perhaps, I have always made an essentially incrementalist case for leftward motion, which to some makes me barely better than a neolib. I guess the main difference is that to me, the leftward motion should be noticeable. So I am left, but I think I'm closer to centre-left than I am to far-left. I've reiterated again and again that anything approaching real revolution is incredibly dangerous and likely to end up in unanticipated negative outcomes. But even that is too far for the neolib acolytes. Well, is this it, I ask you? Is this the world that leftists were so derided for? Seriously. And now there are centrists being applauded for pointing out what the leftists have warned about for decades. And on the other side, whole sections of society are getting on board with the idea that, yep, we might just have to dehumanize whole populations of people. That just might be something we have to do. There are some people who are obviously enjoying this, but that's not supposed to be the compassionate conservatives, is it? But I have questions for the compassionate conservatives, because it seems to me that if their compassion really went that far, then their power was sufficient to have avoided this. If we had meaningfully altered the heading of the ship of state just a little more, a little earlier, instead of making essentially meaningless adjustments to obnoxious fanfare. But now I fear the iceberg is too close to be avoided. And I don't even know what that means, but I know that it means political instability, and that's a bad thing. And if it shocks you to hear a leftist say that they are against political instability, then that's because you have a bad faith concept of the left, for exactly the Overton window related reasons I gave above. But I would guess that none of those people have watched the video this far. Let that be my final point though. In case it isn't quite clear, I respect all the people I've spoken about as good faith actors, but I think that any hyperbole or satirical barbs I have launched in the course of this script pale in comparison to the rhetoric that is aimed at actual left-wing political figures quite casually and without any need for firm evidence being presented. This disparity of coverage is the reason why those further left than me display such a vitriolic contempt for so-called liberals. And yes, I know that you liberals out there think that that automatically makes them into crazy people, but that's because you have never even tried to imagine how they might have come to believe the way that they do. Can you do that?